So let me get this straight. Paramount had Andy Weir, the guy behind The Martian and Project Hail Mary, in the room. Heard a Star Trek pitch, let him talk to Alex Kurtzman and the rest of the Brain Trust, and then said, nah, we're good. I mean, we're good? You are not good. You've not been good. That's the entire problem. And then Andy Weir goes on the Critical Drinkers channel and basically says what a whole lot of fans have been saying for years. Modern Star Trek has lost the plot. And honestly, that's not even the embarrassing part. The embarrassing part is that Paramount apparently had access to an actual sci-fi storyteller with credibility, audience goodwill, and a clear love for the kind of aspirational space adventure people actually miss. And then they chose to stick with Kurtzman Trek. That tells you everything you need to know. Welcome back to The Critical Nerd. If you're a returning subscriber, I humbly say thank you. Good to see you again. If you're new here, this channel is where we break down the entertainment industry, the franchise meltdowns, the media spin, and all the glorious bad decisions these companies keep making like they're legally obligated to do it. So if you would do me a favor, hit that like button, subscribe, ring that notification bell, because today we've got a beautiful little story here. Not just because Andy Weir took a shot at modern Star Trek, but because his comments accidentally exposed what fans have been screaming for years. The wrong people have been running this franchise for way too long. And the more you think about it, the worse it gets. Now, the reason this story hit as hard as it did is because Andy Weir is not just some angry guy on social media farming clicks. This is not some random YouTube rant. This is not some anonymous forum post. This is not some dude with a Roman helmet avatar and 38 followers typing in all caps about how Star Trek died in 2009. This is Andy freaking Weir, the guy who wrote The Martian, the guy who wrote Project Hail Mary, a writer with actual sci-fi credibility, a writer whose work has connected with mainstream audiences, a writer who understands how to make science fiction feel smart, accessible, and exciting without turning it into a lecture, a therapy session, or a LinkedIn diversity seminar in space. And what makes this even funnier is that Weir didn't come off like some frothing lunatic trying to burn everything down. He was actually pretty measured. He didn't say all Star Trek after a certain date should be launched into the sun. He didn't say every single modern project was worthless. He even carved out exceptions. He basically said he liked Strange New Worlds, didn't hate Enterprise, thought Lower Decks was fun. So this is important. This is not blind rage. This is selective criticism, which actually makes it hit harder. Because when somebody says, yeah, there are a couple I can live with, but the rest can go, that lands very differently than some generic, everything is trash rant. That sounds like somebody who still knows what Star Trek is supposed to feel like and can see very clearly when it doesn't. Then he drops the real bomb. He pitched a Star Trek show to Paramount. He was in Zoom calls with the showrunners. He spent time talking with Alex Kurtzman, and they rejected the pitch. That is the story. Because now this is no longer just successful sci-fi writer criticizes modern Trek. Now it becomes Paramount had a proven sci-fi writer in front of them and passed. Brilliant. Absolutely brilliant. Genius level decision making over there. And this, my friends, is where the whole thing becomes almost too perfect. Because if you're Paramount and a guy like Andy Weir wants to pitch a Star Trek project, the normal response should be, interesting. Let's hear him out. And apparently, they did hear him out. But then they still said no, which is insane. Because whatever you think of Andy Weir personally, and whatever you think of his exact style, the one thing you cannot say is that the guy doesn't understand science fiction. He obviously does. He understands wonder. He understands tension. He understands problem solving. He understands how to make science and adventure feel cool. He understands how to make audiences care about people in extraordinary situations. You know, all those little things that used to help Star Trek work. And Paramount looked at that and went, actually, no, we'd rather keep doing whatever this is. Yeah, whatever this is. identity scrambled nonsense, lore breaking nonsense, tone deaf nonsense, a version of Star Trek that somehow manages to feel less inspired by classic Star Trek than every other sci-fi project on the market. That's what makes one of Weir's remarks so devastating. That line about how all modern science fiction seems influenced by the original Star Trek, except modern Star Trek, that is brutal because it rings true. Think about it for just 1 second. So much science fiction today still borrows from the DNA of classic Trek. Curiosity, exploration, optimism, crew dynamics, moral tension, the thrill of discovery, the idea that humanity can aspire to something better. And then you look at what a lot of modern Star Trek became under this regime, and it feels like the franchise is actively embarrassed by the very things that made it matter in the first place. It's darker, meaner, more cynical, more interested in dismantling legacy than building anything new, more interested in content than identity, more interested in checking boxes than telling stories. It's like the people in charge looked at Star Trek and thought, what if we removed the soul, but kept the brand name? And then they wonder why the audience keeps drifting away. Now here's where the irony becomes absolutely brutal for Paramount. Because while Andy Weir is out here catching heat for criticizing modern Star Trek, Project Hail Mary, the movie based on his book, is busy becoming the biggest Hollywood hit of 2026 so far. It opened huge. It held strong. And instead of collapsing after opening weekend like so many overhyped studio products do, it kept going. This is a big original sci-fi movie, not a sequel, not a franchise maintenance chapter, not superhero slop with the logo doing all the heavy lifting. It's Ryan Gosling in space. It's science. It's character. It's tension. It's wonder. It's a movie that actually trusts the audience to pay attention. And audiences showed up for it. That's the part Paramount should find humiliating. Because this is not some safe pre-sold IP machine. This is not a movie riding on 50 years of brand loyalty. This is not nostalgia insurance. This is a $200 million original sci-fi gamble based on writing, concept, execution, and word of mouth, and it's crushing. And why? Because the writing is good, the science is good, the characters are good, and it treats the audience like intelligent people who want to be entertained, not lectured. And this is the guy Paramount said no to. Let that sink in for a moment. The man currently attached to one of the biggest theatrical success stories of the year walked into the room, pitched Star Trek, and Paramount passed. Meanwhile, on the Star Trek side, the contrast is, well, ugly. Starfleet Academy couldn't generate the kind of momentum Paramount desperately needed from a supposed next generation entry point. The show is already ending with season 2. Strange New Worlds already has a final season lined up. That final season is also shortened. And by the time that wraps, Paramount is staring at roughly a couple dozen already announced Star Trek episodes left in the tank. And after that, well, the pipeline looks pretty thin. So that's the scoreboard. Andy Weir is attached to a major hit. Modern Star Trek is visibly shrinking. And Paramount wants us to believe rejecting Andy Weir was the smart call. I mean, come on. And this is the part Hollywood still does not understand. Fans are not frustrated because they're impossible to please. Fans are frustrated because they keep watching obvious opportunities get wasted. That's what the story represents. Because even though we don't know exactly what Andy Weir pitched, and let's be fair, we don't, the point is not that we can definitively say his show would have been a masterpiece. Because we can't. Nobody has seen his pitch. But what we can say is this. If you have a franchise that is clearly struggling with identity, clearly struggling with enthusiasm, clearly struggling with cultural relevance, and a respected sci-fi writer comes in with a pitch, maybe, just maybe, that is a moment to seriously rethink what you're doing. But instead, though, Paramount basically doubled down on the same people, the same creative instincts, the same declining direction, the same brand erosion. And that is why fans get so cynical, because they keep seeing these companies reject what looks like common sense. You had a writer with name value. You had a writer with genre credibility. You had a writer who openly loves the kind of classic sci-fi adventures audiences miss. And you said no. Then you keep feeding the machine that kept producing projects fans either ignored, hated, or forgot existed 5 minutes after release. That's not just a bad call, that's franchise malpractice. Now we need to talk about the bigger issue here, because Andy Weir's comments landed in the exact environment where they were always going to land hardest. A lot of people already think modern Star Trek, under Kurtzman, has been a long, slow brand collapse. And that's why this exploded. Not because one guy was rude, not because someone used a swear word on a podcast, not because Hollywood suddenly discovered that creative people have opinions. It blew up because it tapped into a feeling that has been building for years. How do the same people keep getting rewarded after so many underwhelming results? That's the real question. How many times does the audience have to tune out? How many times does a show have to feel like a meme? How many times does the brand have to shrink before somebody in the boardroom says, maybe this isn't working? Because from the outside, it looks like modern Star Trek has been trapped in that classic Hollywood loop where failure somehow becomes job security. Everything gets spun. Everything gets defended. Everything gets blamed on the audience. Everything is important. Everything is bold. Everything is timely. Everything is for the modern generation. And yet the results keep speaking for themselves. That's why Starfleet Academy angle matters too. Because that show became a symbol of what this thing was heading. Not toward renewal, not toward relevance, not toward that old frontier spirit, toward cringe, toward gimmicks, toward brand exhaustion. And when even a guy like Andy Weir, someone with mainstream success, not just fandom bitterness, looks at all this and basically says, a lot of this sucks. It cuts through the spin because now it's not just fans complaining. Now it's one of the few modern sci-fi writers people actually trust. And of course, because this is Hollywood, some people immediately reacted as if Andy Weir had committed an unspeakable crime. How dare he criticize other writers? How dare he say the quiet part out loud? How dare he not participate in the sacred industry ritual known as toxic positivity? And this is where I completely side against the pearl-clutching nonsense. Because one of the biggest problems in Hollywood right now is that everyone is expected to protect bad work from public criticism as long as it came from the quote-unquote right people. Everybody is supposed to smile politely. Everybody is supposed to clap. Everybody is supposed to say, well, it wasn't for me, but I'm glad it exists. Everybody's supposed to act like obvious failure is some kind of brave artistic experiment. No. Sometimes the work is bad. Sometimes the franchise is being mishandled. Sometimes the people in charge are not the right people. And sometimes saying that publicly is the healthiest thing that can happen. Because shame, frankly, has been missing from Hollywood for quite a while. These people will spend years wrecking beloved IP, lecturing audiences, ignoring criticism, pretending ratings don't matter, pretending viewership doesn't matter, pretending brand damage doesn't matter. And then the second somebody successful says, this isn't good, suddenly that is the scandal? Not years of garbage, not years of wasted potential, not the audience collapse, not the complete inability to restore Star Trek as a real cultural force. Oh, no. The problem is the guy who noticed it. I mean, come on, give me a break. Now, of course, the moment these comments started going viral, the industry defense force activated right on schedule. Crime novelist Don Winslow jumped in to scold Weir and called Alex Kurtzman a visionary writer, creator, and producer. Visionary? I need everyone to sit with that for just a moment. Because this is where the entire conversation starts sounding like parody. You could argue that Weir was too blunt. You could argue that he should have been more diplomatic. You could argue that publicly roasting another creative is bad form. Fine. But calling honest criticism an attack is how Hollywood protects bad decisions from ever being challenged. Since when is a consumer not allowed to say, I don't like the product? Because that was basically Weir's point. He framed himself as a viewer, a fan, a consumer. And unlike the spin merchants who tried to turn this into some unhinged vendetta, he was clearly making a selective critique. He didn't dump on literally everything. He named exceptions. He said there were parts of modern Trek that he liked. So this was never some blanket tantrum. It was a successful sci-fi writer looking at the current state of the franchise and saying, a lot of this isn't working. And the audience reaction to the backlash was telling, because the second people saw that visionary line, a whole lot of them had the same response. Visionary? Based on what? Based on the cancellations? Based on the shrinking slate? Based on the franchise becoming less relevant in pop culture with every passing year? People are not stupid. They can see the ratings conversations. They can see the cancellations. They can see that Star Trek is no longer dominating the cultural conversation the way Paramount desperately wants it to. And then came the apology. Within days, Weir posted an open letter to Kurtzman and basically walked the whole thing back. He said he was trying to be funny. He said it came off as disrespectful and mean. He said the line about Paramount rejecting his pitch was supposed to be self-deprecating. And honestly, I get why he apologized. The man has a huge movie in theaters right now. He's suddenly back in the spotlight. Studios are paying attention to him again. The last thing a guy in that position wants is to become a designated industry problem because he said something too honest at the wrong moment. So yes, he course corrected. I understand it, but here's the thing. The truth does not stop being true just because you apologize for saying it out loud. That apology does not magically make modern Star Trek stronger. It does not make Paramount's rejected decision look smarter. And it definitely does not erase the contrast between Andy Weir standing on top of a major box office win and a Star Trek machine that looks like it's running out of the road. That's why the story landed. Not because comments were shocking, because they were believable. The most damning part of this whole thing is not even the insult. It's not the Draker interview. It's not the backlash. It's not the apology chatter. It's not even the headline. It's this. Paramount had access to a different road. That's what hurts. Because fans can live with failure when at least it looks like somebody tried to make something worthy. What's harder to accept is the sense that the people running the franchise don't even recognize value when it's standing right in front of them. And Andy Weir represents that value. Again, not because every idea he has is automatically genius, not because his pitch was definitely perfect, not because he alone could have saved Star Trek, but because he represents the kind of voice this franchise clearly needed more of. Someone who understands actual sci-fi adventure, someone who knows how to write for a broader audience, someone who isn't embarrassed by sincerity, and someone who seems to understand that people still want stories about being out in space doing cool things. That line matters. People out in space doing cool things. Sounds simple, because it is simple. And somehow that simplicity feels almost revolutionary now. Because modern franchise television has become so addicted to self-importance, subversion, misery, and identity signaling that basic wonder now feels like lost art. Andy Weir gets that. Fans get that. The audience gets that. The people running a lot of these franchises? Apparently not. So no, I don't think the takeaway here is just Andy Weir roasted Kurtzman Trek. I mean, that's funny, but that's not the real takeaway. The real takeaway is that the story confirms what fans have suspected for years. Modern Star Trek didn't just drift off course by accident. It was guided there by people who either didn't understand what made it work or understood it and didn't value it. And when a proven sci-fi storyteller came along with a fresh pitch, they still couldn't see the opportunity. That is the indictment. That is the problem. That is why the story resonates. Because it's not really about one interview. It's about a franchise that keeps rejecting the kind of creative instincts that might actually help it recover. And that is why this whole thing is so devastating for Paramount. Because Andy Weir didn't just insult modern Star Trek, he insulted it while standing on top of a hit Paramount would love to have. That's the part they can't spin away. At the end of the day, Andy Weir didn't expose modern Star Trek because he said something shocking. He exposed it because he said something believable. That's why people reacted. Because deep down, a lot of fans heard these comments and thought, yeah, that tracks. And the worst part for Paramount is that the story writes itself. A respected sci-fi writer, a real Star Trek fan, a guy with proven audience appeal, gets in the room, pitches a show, gets rejected, then looks at the stuff they actually made and basically says, "You passed on me for this?" That is devastating. And honestly, they earned it. Because when you spend years turning one of the most important science fiction brands ever into a confused, cynical, shrinking mess, eventually somebody with credibility is going to say it out loud. And when they do, all the PR spin in the world can't save you. So let me know what you think in the comments. Was Paramount insane for rejecting Andy Weir's Star Trek pitch? Do you think he could have brought the franchise back to something closer to what fans actually wanted? Or do you think the problem goes even deeper than Kurtzman at this point? If you enjoyed this video, if you would, hit like, subscribe, ring the notification bell, and share it out there with your friends and family. And remember, keep your expectations low and your receipts high. I'm the Critical Nerd, and I will see you in the next one.